So, before we even really get into the weeds today, I want you to do something for me. Just picture your dinner plate tonight.
Okay, yeah, like what are we having?
Let's say you're planning on having spaghetti and meatballs. Or maybe you're just grabbing a burger and fries. It feels like the most standard, boring, everyday meal imaginable.
Right, it's comfort food. I mean, it's basically the default setting for a lot of us.
Exactly. But here's where it gets kind of weird. If you were to hop in a time machine and go back to, say, 1490, that meal would be a literal impossibility. It's a geological
I
contradiction.
really love this angle
Eh.
because we completely take it for granted, but the ingredients are from different planets, historically speaking.
Right. The tomatoes and the pasta sauce, those are from the Andes in South America. The beef and the meatball, that's from Eurasia.
And the wheat and the pasta is from the Middle East.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Before 1492, that plate of food couldn't exist because those ingredients had literally never met.
It's true. We tend to think of history as just this series of wars and kings and treaties, but arguably the single biggest event in human history, the thing that actually built the modern world, was when the world's biology collided.
And that is exactly what we are unpacking today. Welcome to this deep dive. I'm your host, and joined as always by our resident historian.
Glad to be here.
So we have a really massive stack of sources here today, drawn from AP European history materials. Specifically, we're focusing on topic 1.8, which covers the late 15th and 16th centuries.
Right.
And the mission for this deep dive is to really understand the Columbian Exchange.
Yeah, it's a term that gets thrown around in textbooks a lot, usually accompanied by, a map with a couple of arrows pointing back and forth across the Atlantic.
Right, the classic graphic.
Exactly. But when you actually dig into these documents, you realize it's not just about trading vegetables or spices. It's about the complete re-engineering of the planet.
We're talking about a multidimensional flow. That's actually the fancy phrase, the notes use of goods, germs, and ideas that didn't just change what people ate, it changed who lived, who died, and who got rich.
That's the big picture here.
Yeah.
For thousands of years, the Old World, meaning Europe, Africa, Asia, and the New World, the Americas, were effectively alien planets to each other.
Totally isolated.
Totally separate biological evolutions. When European maritime empires bridged that gap, they didn't just find a new continent. They triggered a shockwave.
And we are arguably still riding the ripples of that shockwave today. So let's get into it. Looking at these sources, there is one aspect of this exchange that just dwarfs everything else. We really have to start with the biological bomb.
The Great Dying.
Yeah. I mean, I knew the history, broadly speaking. I knew that diseases were a major factor. But reading the specific data here, it just stops you cold. The sources estimate that indigenous populations in the Americas were decimated by up to 90%.
It is a number so large, it's almost impossible to really wrap your head around. It's apocalyptic. We are talking about the complete collapse of entire civilizations.
And it wasn't just warfare, right? I think that's a really common misconception, that this was all about conquistadors with guns and steel swords just hacking their way through the jungle.
The guns played a role, certainly. The military conflict was very real. But the primary culprit was invisible. The sources detail a hit list of pathogens. You've got measles, influenza, typhus.
But the big one.
The big one, the one that really emptied the continents, was smallpox.
Now, this is the part I always kind of get stuck on. Why was it so one-sided? Why didn't the Europeans show up in Mexico and just immediately drop dead from some American flu? Why did the biological weapon only fire in one direction?
That is the million-dollar question. And the answer, fascinatingly enough, comes down to cows and pigs.
Wait, cows and pigs?
Basically, yes. Think about the old world. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, humans have been living in incredibly close quarters with domesticated livestock for thousands of years. We slept near them, we milked them, we butchered them.
Right. It was very agrarian, farm-based life.
Exactly. And most of our deadliest diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, actually started as animal diseases that jumped the species barrier to humans. They are zoonotic.
Oh, I see.
So over centuries, the populations of the old world had built up this genetic library of immunity. They had survived these plagues before.
But in the Americas,
They didn't have those domestic animals, no pigs, no cattle, no horses.
Hmm.
They had llamas and alpacas in the Andes, but they weren't living in the same kind of dense, crowded proximity with them.
right, it's a totally different dynamic.
So when smallpox arrived, it was what epidemiologists call a virgin soil epidemic. The population had absolutely zero biological defense.
That explains so much. There's a note here in the AP Euro sources that is just chilling. It points out that smallpox often weakened societies before military conquest even began.
That's a really crucial insight. There are historical accounts of Spanish explorers arriving at Incan cities and finding them already empty, or in total chaos because the virus had traveled ahead of them along the native trade route.
Wow.
It destabilized political structures, it killed emperors, and it sparked civil wars before a single European soldier marched in.
The specific numbers here really paint the picture. Look at Hispaniola, the Arawak and Taino populations.
Tragically, yes. The data indicates their numbers fell by approximately 300,000 within just a few decades of contact. It was near total erasure.
And the Incan Empire.
That stat is mind-blowing. From around 9 million people in 1530 to just 500,500,000 by 1630.
Imagine a civilization of 9 million people shrinking to the size of a medium city in a single century.
It really reframes the whole narrative of conquest. It wasn't some inherent European superiority in battle or strategy. It was biological sabotage.
But I did want to circle back to my earlier question. Did nothing go back to Europe, biologically speaking?
Well, there's one controversial candidate in the notes. Syphilis.
Ah, yes. The great pox to match the smallpox.
Exactly. Now, it's debated, and the sources emphasize that debate, so we're just reporting what the documents say here. But there was strong evidence that syphilis traveled from the Americas back to Europe. It appeared in Europe shortly after Columbus returned and spread rapidly through the armies of Europe.
But looking at the scale, it wasn't a civilization ender for Europe, was it?
No. It was nasty. It definitely changed social behaviors and it made people miserable, but it didn't cause demographic collapse.
Yeah.
The biological exchange was heavily weighted against the Americas.
However, there is another biological element here that wasn't about germs. It was about the four-legged invasion.
The livestock.
I was actually surprised by how much emphasis the sources put on this. We tend to focus on the people, but the introduction of cattle, pigs, sheep, and horses, that literally changed the physical shape of the land.
It did. You have to remember, there were no horses in the Americas prior to this. No beasts of burden to plow fields or carry heavy loads long distances.
So the introduction of the horse is what? Is it comparable to the invention of the steam engine for these societies?
In many ways, yes, especially for the tribes in the North American plains. It completely revolutionized hunting, warfare, and travel. Suddenly, you could cover vast distances. But the pigs and cattle were just as transformative in a different way.
Because they breed so fast.
They reproduced incredibly rapidly. They ate the local vegetation. They trampled indigenous crops. They physically terraformed the New World to look more like the Old World.
And meanwhile, Europe got the turkey.
The turkey, yes.
Yeah.
A noble bird.
I mean, I love a good Thanksgiving dinner, but it doesn't quite seem like a fair trade for the horse.
Perhaps not.
Yeah.
But the caloric trade, that's where Europe really won out.
And that transitions us perfectly to the next segment of the sources, because while we have this biological bomb going off in the Americas, at the exact same time, you have this massive exchange of food. And this seems like the paradox of the whole Columbian exchange.
Oh, so?
Well, while people are dying in the Americas, the rest of the world is about to get a lot better at staying alive. It's a complete nutritional revolution.
That's the dark irony of it. The grocery list that moved across the Atlantic fundamentally changed global health.
Let's run through the list found in the documents. Going to Europe, Africa, and Asia, we have maize, which is corn, potatoes, tomatoes, squash, cacao, tobacco.
And coming to the Americas, you have wheat, rice, and sugarcane.
I want to focus on the potato for a second because the sources specifically call this an aha moment for European history. Why was the potato such a big deal? I mean, they had wheat, they had bread, they weren't starving all the time.
They weren't starving all the time, but famine was a regular visitor. Wheat is finicky. It can fail if the weather is bad. It's easy for an invading army to burn down. And the caloric yield per acre is really just okay. The potato, it's a superfood.
Is it just about the calories?
It's about density. You can grow 4 times as many calories on the exact same plot of land with potatoes compared to grain. That is a massive efficiency hack. Plus, think about warfare in Europe. If an army marches through your wheat field, they torch it. You starve.
But potatoes are underground.
Exactly. They march right over them, you dig them up later, and you survive.
So what does that actually do to the population?
It explodes it. The sources highlight Ireland and Eastern Europe specifically. Suddenly, you have a food surplus. Fewer famines mean more babies survive to adulthood. This population boom is actually what allows for the urbanization of Europe later on.
Wait, connect those dots for me. How does a potato lead to a city?
Well, if you can feed a family on a small patch of land or feed a whole city with fewer farmers, you free up labor. Those surplus people eventually move to cities to find other work. You effectively couldn't have had the industrial workforce of the 19th century without the caloric surplus provided by the potato in the 18th century.
That is wild. The factories of Manchester or the armies of Napoleon are fueled by an Incan tuber.
Precisely. And in the Americas, the introduction of wheat and rice allowed the colonists to replicate their home diets, essentially turning the land into a neo-Europe. They wanted to eat like they were back in Spain or England.
But let's be honest, they didn't just want to eat well, they wanted to get rich. Which leads us to the money. Because you don't sail a wooden ship across a hostile ocean just to swap salad ingredients.
No, you do it for wealth. And this is where the geopolitical map gets completely redrawn.
The notes mention a shifting center of power. Before this, if you were a big-shot merchant in 1450, where did you live?
You were in the Mediterranean, Venice, Genoa. You were controlling the trade coming from the Silk Road. That was the center of the world economy.
But after 1492,
The Mediterranean becomes a backwater relative to the Atlantic. The new power players are the cities facing west. London, Amsterdam, Antwerp, Bristol.
because that's where the ships were coming in, and they weren't just carrying potatoes.
No,
Yeah.
they were carrying the thing that everyone actually wanted. Precious metals.
Gold and silver.
The influx of mineral wealth from the colonies was unprecedented in human history. We really have to talk about Potosi.
Potosi. The sources mention it multiple times. It's in modern-day Bolivia, right?
Yes, it was basically a mountain made of silver.
Yeah.
At its height, Potosi was one of the largest cities in the world, bigger than London or Paris at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And the silver coming out of that mountain didn't just enrich Spain, it flooded the entire global economy.
Now, there is a fascinating bit of economic theory in the notes here labeled the death of feudalism.
Yes, this is one of my favorite connections of the curriculum.
This feels like a stretch at first glance. How does a silver mine in Bolivia kill a knight in shining armor in France?
It's about inflation
Yeah.
and the nature of money. Think about the feudal system. It's rigid. You have a lord, you have peasants. The peasants pay rent in labor or in a fixed amount of grains. It's a land-based economy.
Okay, so the noble's income is set?
Right. But suddenly, you inject massive amounts of silver into Europe. Prices go up. We call it the price revolution. Inflation happens. If you are a noble living on fixed rents that were set 50 years ago, you're effectively getting poorer every year.
Because your fixed amount of grain or labor is worth less and less real money.
Exactly. But if you are a merchant,
You're a merchant, a trader, someone dealing in cash and selling goods at current market prices. You are getting richer.
so cash becomes king. Wealth accumulation allowed for a move toward market-based economies. You didn't need to be born a duke to have power anymore. You just needed capital.
And the notes say this reduced dependence on peasant labor tied to nobles.
Right. It shifted the power from the land-owning aristocracy to the money-holding merchant class.
The bourgeoisie, if we want to get fancy with our French term.
Indeed. And this lays the groundwork for what the sources call the birth of capitalism. We were still in the era of mercantilism where governments tried to hoard all that gold. But the private trade, the joint stock companies, the investment, that engine started revving up right here.
It's amazing how everything is connected. A mine in Bolivia changes the social structure of France. But speaking of that mine in Bolivia, we really need to pivot to the darkest part of this story, because that silver didn't dig itself.
No. And this is where the exchange becomes a story of deep exploitation. You can't separate the economic boom in Europe from the systems of coercion that built it.
The text mentions imposing structure. This wasn't just about trading, it was about dominance. We're seeing European languages, religion, and governance replacing indigenous systems.
It was a total cultural overhaul, and the role of Christianity was central. Missionaries and colonial officials weren't just preaching, they were enforcing religious conversion as a tool of control. It was about creating a compliant society that mirrored Europe.
But they needed workers. And we established in the first segment that the indigenous workforce was dying off at a terrifying rate due to disease.
That is the labor crisis. Imagine you are a Spanish mine owner in Potosi, or a Portuguese sugar planter in Brazil. You have an insatiable demand for labor to extract this wealth, but your local workforce is collapsing.
So how did they try to solve it? The sources list a few systems. First, the encomienda. Can you break that down?
The encomienda system was an early attempt by the Spanish. Ideally, in theory, and I stress in theory, it was a system where settlers protected natives and taught them Christianity. In exchange, the natives provided labor.
Protected. I'm looking at the description of the conditions here, and protection feels like the wrong word.
It's a euphemism. The expert notes clarify that this effectively devolved into de facto slavery. It was brutal exploitation. But, as we noted, the indigenous population continued to plummet. They simply couldn't sustain the workforce numbers the Europeans demanded.
And that leads us to the major turning point, the shift to the transatlantic slave trade.
Yes, the collapse of one population led to the forced migration of another. To maintain the extraction of wealth, specifically sugar and silver, Europeans began importing enslaved Africans on a massive scale.
Why Africans? I know that sounds like a naive question, but from a strictly historical, economic perspective of the time, why did they make that specific shift? We're just reporting what the documents outline here.
It goes back to the biological point we started with. Africans, like Europeans, had exposure to Old World diseases. They had immunity to smallpox and measles. They also had experience with tropical agriculture and metallurgy. So, in the cold, calculated logic of the colonial economy, they were the solution to the labor shortage.
It's chilling to think of human beings as a solution to an economic problem.
It is. But that decision created the foundation of the Atlantic economy. The sources give us specific case studies. We mentioned the silver mines in Potosi, which was brutal, dangerous work.
But also sugar.
Sugar was the oil of the 16th century, wasn't it?
Absolutely. In the Caribbean and Brazil, sugar production was incredibly labor-intensive. It was backbreaking work in the heat. The mortality rates on these plantations were horrific. It drove a constant churning demand for more enslaved laborers from Africa. And further north, in the English colonies like Virginia, it was tobacco.
Right. There, the system relied initially on indentured servants, poor Europeans working off a debt. But over time, especially after Bacon's Rebellion and as economic conditions improved in England, the reliance shifted heavily toward enslaved Africans.
This created a whole new social reality, didn't it? The sources mention something called the casta system.
This is specific to Spanish America. Because you had these three groups, Europeans, indigenous peoples, and Africans living in close proximity, the Spanish obsessed over categorization. They created a complex legal hierarchy based on race.
So your status wasn't just about money, it was about your DNA.
Your racial heritage determined everything. The taxes you paid, the clothes you were legally allowed to wear, your rights in court. At the top were the Peninsulares who were born in Spain, then the Creoles who were Europeans born in the Americas, and then a descending ladder of mixed race categories like mestizos and mulattoes.
It was essentially designed to keep the minority white population in power.
Exactly. And that is a heavy legacy. We're seeing the invention of modern racial hierarchies right here in the 16th century. It codified the idea that biology equals status.
So let's try to synthesize this. We've covered a lot of ground today. The biological wipeout, the caloric revolution of the potato, the silver flowing into banks, and the labor systems that underpinned it all. If you had to sum up the Columbian exchange in a nutshell, what is it?
It was the moment the world got smaller. It was the integration of the planet. For Europe, it was an era of unprecedented growth, wealth, and power. For the Americas and Africa, it was largely a story of demographic tragedy, exploitation, and cultural erasure.
It's like the world was rewritten.
That's a perfect way to put it. The map was redrawn, not just geographically, but biologically and socially. European powers leveraged this new system to secure resources, which set the stage for centuries of imperial competition. You can't understand the British Empire or the rise of the United States or modern global trade without understanding this foundational shift.
And the sources leave us with this thought. Patterns of inequality and cultural change persist today.
That's really the so what of this whole deep dive.
So here is something for you to think about as you go about your day. If the map of the world's economy and social hierarchy was essentially drawn in the 16th century, to what extent are we still living in the direct aftermath of the Columbian exchange?
It's a question worth asking every time you look at a global supply chain, or, frankly, every time you eat a French fry.
Exactly. Look at your dinner plate tonight and ask, how did this get here? You might find a history that spans oceans and centuries. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll catch you next time.